"Sir, you don't belong here." The words landed before the silence did, sharp and clean, cutting through the polished air of the Grand Regent Hotel like something out of place in a room that prided itself on perfection. And for a moment, everything seemed to pause. The soft hum of the chandelier lights, the muted clink of glasses from the lounge bar, even the quiet rhythm of footsteps across the marble floor. All of it stilled around a single figure standing just inside the revolving doors. Samuel Carter didn't move. He stood there in a worn gray coat that had seen too many winters, the fabric thinning at the elbows, his shoes carrying the dust of sidewalks that stretched miles beyond the city's carefully curated center. The cold from outside still clung to him, a faint trace of wind and street grit that didn't belong in a place where the air always smelled faintly of citrus polish and expensive cologne. Richard Collins adjusted his cufflinks with slow precision, his reflection crisp in the mirrored wall behind the front desk, before finally looking up again, his expression tightening, not in anger, not even in irritation, but in something colder, something practiced. Control, image, order. That was his world, and Samuel Carter standing there, quiet and unmoving, disrupted all three. "I said," Richard repeated, his voice lower now, firmer, "you need to leave." A few guests nearby shifted slightly, their attention drawn without them realizing it, like an invisible thread pulling their gaze toward the scene. A woman in a tailored coat paused mid-step, her phone still in her hand. A bellhop froze beside a luggage cart, unsure whether to continue or disappear. Samuel's eyes moved slowly, not in defiance, not in fear, but in quiet observation, taking in the gleam of the marble beneath his feet, the towering glass walls that reflected a version of the world he no longer occupied, the distance between who he was now and whatever this place expected him to be. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging something unspoken, but he didn't step back. Not yet. Richard's jaw tightened, just slightly, the only sign that something underneath his composed exterior had shifted. He took a step forward, closing the distance by a few feet, enough to assert presence without raising his voice. "This is a private property," he said, each word measured. "We maintain a certain standard here." The word standard hung in the air, heavier than it should have been, carrying with it a meaning that didn't need to be explained. Samuel's hand moved slowly, almost absently, brushing against the front of his coat as if checking for something that wasn't there anymore. Maybe a habit from another life, another routine. His fingers paused, then dropped. He exhaled softly, the sound barely audible, yet somehow louder than anything else in that moment. Behind him, the revolving door turned once more, letting in a brief rush of cold air before sealing shut again, restoring the hotel's carefully controlled warmth. Samuel's reflection flickered across the glass, just for a second, before disappearing into the layered lights of the lobby. Richard glanced past him, toward the entrance, as if already deciding how quickly this disruption could be erased, how seamlessly the illusion of perfection could be restored. But something about the stillness in Samuel's posture made it linger longer than it should have. Not resistance, not confrontation, just presence. And for the first time, it made the room feel slightly smaller, like the polished space couldn't quite contain what was unfolding inside it. Samuel Carter had learned a long time ago that silence could be louder than any argument, that sometimes the strongest thing a man could do was simply stand still and let the world reveal itself. And so he did not rush to speak, did not raise his voice, did not offer excuses that would only be dismissed before they were finished. He just remained where he was, breathing slowly, his eyes steady, his presence quiet but unshaken in a space that seemed designed to erase men like him without leaving a trace. And for a brief second, it was as if the years peeled back from his posture, revealing something that had nothing to do with the worn coat or the tired lines around his eyes, something rooted deeper, something that had once belonged in places like this without question. There had been a time when polished floors and glass walls were not barriers but reflections, when doors opened before he reached for them, when people looked at him and saw possibility instead of inconvenience. And though that life had slipped through his hands piece by piece, not all at once but slowly, quietly, like sand through open fingers, the memory of it had never fully left him. It lingered in the way he stood, in the calm precision of his movements, in the refusal to shrink. Even when the world insisted he should. Richard Collins noticed it too, though he could not name it. A subtle discomfort that crept beneath his controlled demeanor. Something about the man in front of him that did not match the story his mind had already written, because Samuel did not look away, did not fidget, did not plead. And that absence of expected behavior created a small fracture in the carefully constructed order Richard depended on. "You are making this more difficult than it needs to be," Richard said, his tone tightening just enough to signal that patience was running thin, though his voice never rose above the polished calm expected of someone in his position, because appearances mattered here, even in moments like this, especially in moments like this. Samuel finally moved, but not in retreat, his hand reaching toward the edge of the front desk where a small stack of brochures had been slightly misaligned, one corner sticking out just enough to catch the eye of someone who noticed details, and without asking, without drawing attention, he adjusted it, straightening the edges so they sat perfectly flush again. The motion simple, almost instinctive, the kind of small correction that spoke of a habit formed long before life had taken its turn, and for a split second, the gesture felt out of place in a man who was being told he did not belong. A guest nearby watched closely now, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to something more uncertain, as if she was trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she had already assumed, because there was a quiet dignity in that movement that did not align with the role Samuel had been assigned the moment he walked through the door. The air seemed to tighten again, not with noise but with the weight of unspoken judgment, of glances exchanged quickly and then pulled away, of the invisible line that separated those who were allowed to remain from those who were expected to disappear. Samuel let his hand fall back to his side, his fingers brushing lightly against the fabric of his coat, and for a moment, his gaze drifted toward the far end of the lobby where sunlight filtered faintly through the tall windows, casting long reflections across the marble floor, and there was something almost distant in his eyes, as if he was looking not just at the room but through it, beyond it, into something no one else there could see. "Sir," Richard said again, this time with a sharper edge, stepping closer, the distance between them narrowing enough to make the difference in their positions unmistakably clear. "This is your final warning." And yet, even as he spoke, there was a flicker of hesitation, small but present, because something about Samuel Carter refused to fit neatly into the category Richard needed him to occupy, and that uncertainty, however brief, was enough to disturb the flawless surface of the moment. Richard Collins had built his entire career on the belief that control was everything, that a space as pristine as the Grand Regent did not simply maintain its reputation by accident, but by careful, relentless enforcement of standards that left no room for uncertainty, no room for disruption, and certainly no room for someone who stood outside the image the hotel sold to every guest who stepped through its doors. And yet now, standing only a few feet away from Samuel Carter, he felt something unfamiliar pressing at the edges of that control, something subtle but persistent, like a quiet crack forming beneath polished glass. He straightened his posture, drawing a slow breath as if resetting the room back into alignment, his hand brushing lightly against the edge of the front desk where everything had to remain exact, every line clean, every detail intentional, because that was how order was preserved, not through force, but through consistency, through the unspoken understanding that some things belonged and others did not. "You are not a guest here," he said, his voice steady, measured, carrying just enough authority to remind anyone listening that he was the one who defined the rules within these walls. "And if you are not a guest, then you have no reason to remain." The words sounded simple, almost procedural, but beneath them was a deeper insistence, a need to restore balance to a moment that had drifted too far from its expected course. Samuel Carter listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but there was a faint shift in his gaze, not toward Richard, but toward the space around him, as if he was noticing things others overlooked, the slight tremor in the reflection of the chandelier lights against the marble floor, the distant hum of an elevator arriving somewhere beyond the lobby, the quiet tension in the shoulders of the bellhop, who still had not moved, all of it registering in a way that suggested he was not overwhelmed by the moment but fully present within it. He had been in rooms like this before, though no one here would believe it. Rooms where decisions were made with a single word, where men in tailored suits leaned forward instead of away when he spoke, where his presence did not need to be justified. And while those days were long behind him, the memory of them had shaped something in him that could not be undone, something that remained even now. Beneath the surface, steady and unyielding, Richard noticed the lack of reaction, and it unsettled him more than open defiance would have, because there was no resistance to push against, no argument to shut down, just a quiet stillness that refused to bend, and that stillness began to draw attention in ways he could not easily control. A couple near the lounge now openly watching, their conversation forgotten, a concierge glancing over from across the room before quickly looking away, as if unsure whether acknowledging the scene would make it more real. "Security will escort you out if necessary," Richard added, the words sharper now, though still contained, because raising his voice would mean losing the composure he had spent years perfecting. And composure was everything in a place like this. Samuel's lips parted slightly, not in protest, but as if he was about to say something small and deliberate. But then he paused, the moment stretching just long enough to shift the air again. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, calm, carrying no anger, no urgency, only a quiet certainty that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the situation itself. "I am not here to cause trouble," he said, each word clear, unhurried. "I just needed a moment to stand somewhere warm." The simplicity of the statement hung in the air, unembellished, undeniable, and for a second, it did something unexpected. It made the room feel colder, not because of what was said, but because of how it was said, because there was no demand in it, no attempt to justify his presence beyond a basic human need. And that contrast, between the warmth he asked for and the chill of the space around him, created a tension that could not be easily dismissed. Richard's expression tightened again, not out of cruelty, but out of something closer to discomfort, because the situation was no longer as clean as he wanted it to be. It was no longer just about policy or image. It had become something more complicated, something that did not fit neatly into the rules he enforced, and yet those rules were all he had to rely on, so he held on to them, even as the moment continued to shift in ways he could not fully control. The word warm lingered in the air longer than it should have, simple and human in a place built on curated comfort, and for a brief moment, it unsettled something beneath the polished surface of the Grand Regent, not enough to change anything, but enough to make the silence feel heavier, more deliberate, as if the room itself was deciding how to respond. Richard Collins exhaled slowly through his nose, the kind of controlled breath that signaled the end of patience, his gaze sharpening not with anger but with resolution, because whatever uncertainty had flickered in the moment before could not be allowed to take root. Not here, not under his watch. And so he reached for the one thing that had never failed him, authority, wrapped in calm precision. "This is not a shelter," he said, each word clean, clipped, carrying the quiet weight of policy rather than emotion. "And it is not a place for people to come in off the street." The statement was not loud, but it traveled, slipping into the awareness of everyone within earshot, drawing their attention more openly now, no longer hidden behind glances or half-turned shoulders. Samuel Carter did not respond immediately, his eyes lowering just slightly, not in submission, but in thought, as if he was measuring the space between what had been said and what it truly meant, his fingers curling faintly against the fabric of his coat, feeling the thinness of it, the way it no longer held warmth the way it once might have. And for a second, the contrast between the world outside and the one he stood in now pressed in on him from both sides, cold and polished, absence and abundance. A faint sound broke through the stillness, the soft squeak of shoes approaching across the marble, and a uniformed security guard stepped into view from the far end of the lobby, his posture firm but uncertain, as if he had been called into a situation that did not fully match the expectations set for him. His eyes flicking briefly to Samuel before settling on Richard, waiting for direction rather than judgment. Richard gave a small nod, barely noticeable, but enough. The kind of gesture that did not need explanation because it carried authority on its own, and the guard began to move closer, each step measured, cautious, aware that eyes were on him now, that this moment had become something more than routine. Samuel watched him approach, Not with fear, not with resistance, but with a quiet awareness that settled deeper into his posture, his shoulders remaining steady, his stance unchanged, as if he had already accepted what would come next, not because he agreed with it, but because he understood how the world worked, how decisions like these were made long before they were spoken aloud. He shifted slightly then, just enough to reach into the inner pocket of his coat, the movement slow, deliberate, not sudden, not threatening, and for a brief second, the security guard hesitated, his weight shifting from one foot to the other, uncertain whether to continue or pause, the tension in the air tightening just a fraction more. Samuel's hand emerged holding something small, a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, creased from being opened and closed too many times, and he looked at it for a moment before speaking, his voice still calm, still measured. "I used to carry business cards," he said quietly, almost to himself, though the words carried far enough for others to hear. "Now it is just this." He unfolded the paper slightly, not enough to reveal everything, just enough to remind himself of what it was, then folded it back again, slipping it between his fingers as if it held more weight than it appeared to. Richard's expression did not change, but there was a flicker behind his eyes, a brief disruption in the certainty he projected, because the moment had shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to make it harder to dismiss the man in front of him as nothing more than a problem to be removed. The security guard stopped a few feet away now, close enough to act, but still waiting, his gaze moving between the two men as if trying to understand what kind of situation this truly was, routine or something else entirely. Samuel looked up again, meeting Richard's eyes not with challenge, but with a quiet steadiness that did not ask for permission to exist. And in that look, there was no demand, no plea, only a simple presence that refused to be erased, even as the system around him prepared to do exactly that. The folded paper rested lightly between Samuel Carter's fingers, but the way he held it made it feel heavier than anything else in the room, as if it carried a weight no one else could see. And for a brief moment, the movement of the entire lobby seemed to slow around that small detail, conversations softening into whispers, footsteps losing their rhythm, attention narrowing toward the quiet center where one man stood and refused to disappear. The security guard shifted again, closer now, his presence firm but not aggressive, his hand hovering near his side, as if unsure whether to reach out or simply wait. Because something about the scene no longer felt routine, it felt watched, measured, like a moment that would be remembered differently depending on what happened next. Richard Collins straightened his jacket, the subtle motion restoring his sense of control, his eyes briefly flicking to the surrounding guests before returning to Samuel, aware now that this was no longer a private correction but a public display, and in a place like this, perception mattered as much as action, perhaps even more. "Sir," the security guard said carefully, his voice lower than expected, respectful but firm, "I am going to need you to step outside with me." The words were practiced, neutral, designed to resolve the situation without escalation, but they carried an expectation that the moment would end quietly, efficiently, without resistance. Samuel did not argue, did not protest. He simply looked at the guard for a second, then nodded once, a small acknowledgement that seemed less like agreement and more like understanding. And as he shifted his weight slightly, preparing to move, his hand tightened just a fraction around the folded paper, the creases pressing deeper into his skin. But before he took a step, something else caught his attention, a faint sound from the far side of the lobby, subtle at first, the low hum of an engine outside the glass doors, followed by the almost synchronized turn of heads from a few staff members who had noticed it before anyone else, trained to recognize the arrival of something important, something that required immediate awareness. A sleek black car had just pulled up to the entrance, its reflection stretching across the polished floor like a dark line cutting through the room, and the valet, who had been standing near the door, suddenly straightened, his posture shifting from idle to alert in a way that signaled recognition, not of a vehicle, but of who might be inside it. Richard noticed it too, his attention pulling briefly away from Samuel, his mind already calculating, adjusting, preparing to transition from one role to another, from enforcement to hospitality, because that was the nature of his position, to pivot seamlessly between. maintaining order and welcoming power. The revolving door began to turn slowly, the glass panels catching the light as they moved, and with it came a shift in the atmosphere, subtle but undeniable, like a current passing through the room that changed the direction of every glance, every breath. Samuel paused, not because he was waiting for anything, but because something in the air had changed, something he could not yet see but could feel. A quiet pull that held the moment in place just a second longer. The security guard hesitated again, his focus briefly drawn toward the entrance, then back to Samuel, caught between duty and distraction, uncertain which moment required his attention more. Richard took a step back toward the front desk, his expression resetting, smoothing out any trace of tension, preparing to greet whoever was about to walk in with the same polished composure he always displayed. But there was a flicker beneath it now, a slight urgency, because timing mattered. And this interruption had come at the exact wrong moment. The doors continued to turn, the outside lights spilling in for a brief second before narrowing again. And as the figure beyond the glass began to take shape, still partially obscured, still undefined, the entire room seemed to lean toward it, waiting, holding its breath, suspended between what had just happened and whatever was about to happen next. The revolving door completed its slow turn with a soft, controlled hush, sealing the outside world away once more, yet somehow carrying its presence inside. And for a moment, no one moved, not fully, not decisively, as if the entire lobby had entered a suspended state where time stretched just enough to make every detail sharper, every breath more noticeable. Samuel Carter remained where he stood, the folded paper still resting between his fingers, his hand steady despite the faint tremor of cold that lingered beneath his coat. And though the warmth of the lobby surrounded him, it did not quite reach him, not the way it reached others. It hovered just out of grasp, like something offered but not given. The security guard lowered his hand slightly, no longer certain whether to proceed or pause, his posture shifting from action to hesitation, because the moment had changed in a way that did not come with instructions. And without instructions, there was only instinct, and instinct, in a place like this, was not always trusted. Richard Collins stood behind the desk now, his reflection once again aligning with the polished surfaces around him, his expression reset to the version of himself that guests expected to see, composed, welcoming, precise. Yet beneath that surface, there was a subtle tension, a tightening that had not been there before, because the interruption had not resolved, it had only paused. And unresolved moments had a way of unraveling control if left unattended. The light from outside filtered through the tall glass panels, softer now, diffused by the shifting clouds beyond the city skyline, casting long, muted reflections across the marble floor that seemed to stretch towards Samuel's feet, stopping just short, as if even the light hesitated to cross an invisible boundary. He glanced down briefly, noticing the faint outline of his own reflection, distorted slightly by the angle, and for a second, it felt unfamiliar, not because it had changed, but because of where it was, because of what it represented in a place that did not recognize it. His grip on the folded paper loosened just enough for the edge to slip against his palm, and he adjusted it again, carefully, almost thoughtfully, as if the act itself grounded him, reminded him of something beyond the room, beyond the eyes that watched him without truly seeing. A quiet murmur passed through a small group near the lounge, not loud enough to interrupt, but enough to signal awareness, curiosity, the subtle shift from passive observation to quiet speculation, because something was happening, something not yet defined, and people could feel it even if they could not name it. Samuel took a slow breath, the kind that filled his chest, and held there for a moment before releasing. Steady, controlled, and in that breath, there was no panic, no urgency. Only a quiet endurance that had been built over years of moments like this, moments where the world narrowed down to a single choice. To stay or to step away, to hold or to let go. He did not move yet, not because he refused, but because something within him had decided that this moment deserved to be fully felt, fully seen, even if no one else would remember it that way. The security guard glanced once more toward the entrance, then back to Samuel, his eyes softer now, less certain, as if he too sensed that whatever came next would not be as simple as escorting a man outside. Richard's fingers tapped lightly against the desk. A small, controlled motion that betrayed the tension beneath his calm exterior, because the timing, the interruption, the presence of both situations colliding at once created a fracture in the order he relied on, and fractures, no matter how small, had a way of spreading if not contained. The air in the lobby felt different now, not warmer, not colder, just heavier, like something unspoken had settled into the space between people, waiting, and in that wait, Samuel Carter stood quietly, not demanding recognition, not asking for understanding, but existing fully in a place that was not designed to hold him. And for the first time since he had stepped inside, the room did not feel entirely certain of what to do with him. The man who stepped through the revolving door did not rush, did not announce himself. Yet the shift in the room followed him instantly, subtle but undeniable, like a current moving beneath still water, and those who recognized it did so not with words but with posture, with the way their shoulders straightened, with the way their attention sharpened without meaning to. Nathan Carter walked in with measured steps, his coat tailored, his presence composed, the kind of quiet authority that did not need volume to be felt. And though his expression remained neutral, his eyes moved with precision, taking in the room in a single sweep, the front desk, the staff, the guests, the stillness that lingered where movement should have been. Richard Collins stepped forward immediately, the practiced smile already forming, the tension from moments before carefully folded away beneath professional ease. "Welcome back, Mr. Carter," he said, his tone warm, controlled, as if nothing in the past minute had existed at all, as if the room had always been exactly as it should be. Nathan gave a slight nod, acknowledging the greeting without fully engaging, his attention already shifting past Richard, drawn towards something else, something that did not belong in the polished symmetry of the lobby, yet stood at its center, unmoved, unchanged. Samuel Carter had not turned when the door opened, had not reacted to the shift in atmosphere, but now, slowly, almost instinctively, he lifted his gaze, not searching, not expecting, just responding to something familiar that brushed against him like a memory he had not prepared to face. Their eyes met across the space, not dramatically, not suddenly, but with a quiet recognition that carried weight beyond the moment itself, and in that instant, the distance between them felt both vast and non-existent at the same time. Nathan's steps slowed, then stopped completely, the rhythm of the room breaking around him. As he stood still, his focus narrowing, his composure holding but tightening just slightly at the edges, because what he was seeing did not align with where he was, did not belong in this setting. And yet there it was, undeniable. Richard noticed the pause, the shift, the disruption in the expected flow, and for a brief second, confusion flickered behind his eyes, his gaze following Nathan's line of sight until it landed on Samuel. And in that connection, something began to unravel, not visibly, not all at once, but enough to unsettle the certainty he had relied on just moments before. The security guard stepped back half a pace, sensing without instruction that the situation had changed, that whatever authority he had been prepared to act on no longer applied in the same way, and the small movement created space, both physical and unspoken, between Samuel and the rest of the room. Nathan took a step forward, then another, slower now, more deliberate, each movement carrying a weight that drew attention without asking for it. And as he approached, the quiet hum of the lobby seemed to fade further, replaced by a stillness that felt almost intentional, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Samuel remained where he was, his posture steady, his expression calm, but there was a shift in his eyes now, something softer, something deeper, not surprise, not shock, but recognition layered with time, with distance, with everything that had passed between who they had been and who they were now. Nathan stopped just a few feet away, close enough to see the details others had overlooked, the wear in the coat, the lines in Samuel's face, the quiet dignity that had never left him, and for a moment, he said nothing, the silence stretching between them, not empty, but full of meaning that did not need to be spoken. Richard stood frozen behind the desk, his mind racing to understand, to reconcile the man he had dismissed with the man now standing before him. And in that space of uncertainty, the balance of the room shifted completely, no longer centered on policy or control, but on something far more difficult to manage, something human, something real, something he could not undo. And then, without raising his voice, without breaking the calm that defined him, Nathan Carter spoke, his words steady, clear, carrying through the silence with a weight that stopped everything in its place. "That is my father." The words did not echo, yet they seemed to settle into every corner of the room, pressing into the polished marble, the glass walls, the still air that no longer knew how to move. And for a moment, no one spoke, not because they chose silence, but because something deeper had taken it from them. Richard Collins felt it first in his chest, a sudden tightening that had nothing to do with breath and everything to do with realization, the kind that arrives without warning and refuses to be ignored. His posture still upright, his expression still composed, but beneath it, something had shifted irreversibly, because the man he had reduced to a problem now stood redefined in a single sentence. And that sentence carried more authority than anything he had said before. His eyes moved quickly, from Nathan Carter to Samuel, then back again, searching for some detail that would undo what he had just heard. Some sign that this was a misunderstanding, but there was none, only the quiet certainty in Nathan's gaze, the steady presence in Samuel's stance, and the undeniable connection that existed between them. The security guard lowered his hands completely now, stepping back without being told, his role dissolving in the face of a truth that no longer required enforcement, only acknowledgement. A murmur spread softly through the lobby, no longer hidden, no longer restrained. A ripple of realization passing from one observer to another, reshaping the moment in real time, because everything they thought they understood had just been rewritten. Richard swallowed once, the motion small but visible, his mind racing to recover, to respond, to regain some measure of control. But control did not come easily now, not when the foundation it stood on had shifted so suddenly, so completely. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice carefully measured, though a faint strain edged beneath the surface. "I was not aware." He stopped himself, the sentence falling apart before it could be completed, because awareness was no longer the point. The damage had already been done in the space where assumptions had been allowed to stand unchallenged. Nathan did not respond immediately, his attention still fixed on Samuel, his expression no longer neutral, but softened in a way that revealed something deeply personal beneath the composed exterior, and without a word, he stepped closer, closing the remaining distance between them, not as a man approaching a stranger, but as a son returning to something that had never truly left him. Samuel's eyes held his, steady, calm, but now there was something else there too, something warmer, something that carried both pride and quiet restraint, as if he was holding back more than he allowed himself to show. And for a second, the years between them seemed to compress into a single moment, heavy but unspoken. Nathan reached out then, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a deliberate care, his hand lifting just enough to adjust the collar of Samuel's worn coat. A simple gesture, almost instinctive, yet it carried a weight that no words could match, because it was not about appearance, it was about acknowledgement, about presence, about seeing someone fully where others had refused to. The room watched in silence, not out of obligation, but because something real was unfolding in front of them, something that did not fit into the polished structure of the hotel, something that could not be managed or redirected or dismissed. Richard stood frozen, the distance between him and the two men now feeling far greater than the few feet that separated them. His authority diminished not by confrontation, but by truth, by the quiet dismantling of everything he had assumed. "Sir," he tried again, softer now, less certain. "I sincerely apologize." The words felt formal, practiced, but beneath them was something more fragile, something closer to recognition than obligation. Samuel did not respond immediately, his gaze shifting briefly toward Richard, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a calm that carried its own kind of weight. And when he finally spoke, his voice was as steady as it had been from the beginning. "It is not about apology," he said quietly. "It is about how you see people when you think no one is watching." And in that moment, the silence returned, deeper now, not empty, but filled with something that could not be undone, something that would remain long after the room found its voice again. No one moved right away, not after words like that, Not after something so simple had stripped away everything else that used to matter in the room. And for a moment, the Grand Regent no longer felt like a place of status or perfection. It felt like a space holding a truth it did not know how to carry. Nathan Carter stood beside his father, his hand still resting lightly against the worn fabric of Samuel's coat, not adjusting it anymore, just there, present, as if the gesture itself had become something more than movement, something steady, grounding, real, and Samuel allowed it. Not with surprise, not with hesitation, but with a quiet acceptance that spoke of a bond untouched by time or circumstance. Richard Collins remained behind the desk, his posture still upright, but the confidence that once defined it had softened into something else, something uncertain, his hands resting against the polished surface as if he needed it to steady himself. His reflection in the mirrored wall no longer as sharp as it had been before, slightly blurred by the shift in how he saw the moment, and perhaps how the moment saw him. The guest who had once watched out of curiosity now stood in silence, not looking for entertainment anymore, but witnessing something they could not easily dismiss, something that would follow them beyond the lobby, beyond the doors, into the quiet spaces where memory lingered. Samuel Carter turned his gaze once more toward the tall windows, the light outside now warmer, softer, stretching across the floor in long reflections that no longer stopped short, reaching instead toward where he stood, touching the edges of his shoes, his coat, his presence, as if the space itself had finally allowed him to belong, even if only for a moment. He drew in a slow breath, deeper this time, and the warmth he had asked for earlier seemed to settle differently now, not given by the room, but by something within it that had changed. Nathan followed his father's gaze for a second, then looked back at him, his expression calm but filled with something unspoken, respect, gratitude, perhaps even a quiet regret for time that could not be reclaimed, yet nothing in his posture suggested distance, only closeness, only presence. "Let us go," Nathan said softly, not as a command, not as an escape, but as an invitation, one that did not erase what had happened, but chose not to stay in it. Samuel nodded once, the movement small but certain, and together, they turned, not quickly, not with urgency, but with a calm that carried its own kind of strength, their steps aligned not by effort, but by familiarity, as if the distance between them had always been temporary. As they walked toward the exit, no one stopped them, no one spoke, the path opened without instruction, without resistance, because something in the room understood now, understood that authority did not always come from position, and dignity did not need permission to exist. Richard watched them go, his eyes following their reflection across the glass, the image stretching and shifting with each step until it reached the door, and in that reflection, he saw something he had not seen before, not in them, but in himself, a moment he could not undo, a choice he would have to carry long after the lobby returned to its usual rhythm. The revolving door turned once more, slowly, quietly, and as Samuel and Nathan stepped through it, the outside air met them without resistance, cool but open, real in a way the inside had not been, and for a second, the light caught them both, side by side, before the door completed its turn and the scene closed behind them. Inside, the silence remained just a little longer, not empty, but full, as if the building itself needed time to settle, to remember what had just passed through it. And when the sounds of the lobby finally returned, the footsteps, the quiet conversations, the distant clink of glass, they carried a different weight, softer, more aware, as if something unseen had shifted in the space between people, something that would not be spoken aloud, but would be felt in the way they looked at one another, in the moments when no one thought they were being watched.